Hello. Why processors are not so fast? Why they don't speed up like they were in good old times? And I want to make sure that we agree that there were good old times. So around 22 years ago, in year 2000, in a standard computation benchmark, the applications were running at whatever 3.3 thousands MIPS, and this is a benchmark. It's Whetstones, if I remember right, or sorry, Drystones benchmark, and compared with that time, today's computers speed up by a factor of 250. So if you buy the highest in class not workstation processor, but even if you go with a workstation processor, the speed up it is not up to more than 1000 times. And let's be clear, the Athlon is one core processor, and today's comparison, which will be 600 times, it is a 64 cores processor. And but if you go 22 years ahead, before year 2000, it was kind of launched 8086, and that processor was 10,000 times slower than the Athlon. So you can see 10,000 times speed up, and then it really tanked, it looks. And we have some caveats to put. And first of all, there were processors which could process at the time more things. And the most iconic one, I would say, it was the Cray. So the Cray would have the same power. uh, I mean, the electricity bill would be higher, but it will have the same performance of a Pentium at around 100 megahertz, or a PowerPC at 80 megahertz from 1993, and Pentium at 100 was launched in 1995. And the speed up, if we'll take just this processor from till 2000, we can say, look, the speed up versus the Athlon of before, it will be of just 20 times. And we'll say, look, in fact, we sped up. But this would be really cherry picking the data. Also, a more realistic comparison, it would be not the 8086, because this will just say that one class of processors didn't speed up so much, but it will be kind of this VIX blah blah blah, which had much more performance than an 8086 by around 3 times. So the speed ups are not as 10,000 to 200, but it's 3000 versus 250, 600. So let's add one more wrap up about caveats, is that computation right now is much more diverse, and there are things which you can't do at all with the old processors. So most processors by 80s, I mean all of them, they didn't have in them a floating point unit, or it was named a coprocessor. So you'd have to also attach a separate processor. But today we have GPUs, and the GPUs do, in some needed cases, a lot of computation which was not possible and is not possible kind of to do on CPUs. But even if you want to do on CPUs machine learning, that was not even accessible. You didn't have the systems. It is very known that the systems around 1980s they could not even address more than 1 megabyte of memory. And today the trend of a regular screen resolution, the 4K, the tendency of it at least, only the screen itself without any backup frame, it's 32 megabytes, which would be just kind of accessible at around year 2000 to process it. But I won't say that it's not fair to compare processors in 80s versus 2000. And there are more things, and some of them are crucial, like but not limited to security instructions, accelerations, or virtualization instructions. So, uh, so there are many things that an actual processor can do, which that possibly not even possible. They are not possible, basically. So the first reason, I'm going to the reasons, but some of them are more trivial than that. We can see that the processors grew up in area. So a processor in that times, it was kind of 0.7 by 0.7 centimeters, or I don't know, it will be kind of a third of the inch squared, and they would consume 2 watts or 3.3 watts in the highest configuration, 286. And this is the processor of 1982, but even processors before could do all the computation with less power. And even by year 2000, the processors would reach kind of around 1000 watt in the highest end configuration. So, and the area, it's already in a bigger ballpark, kind of double by both dimensions, and this with less wattage. So the jump from 80s to 2000 was the biggest in area, in wattage, and the Threadripper, even if it adds the same dimensions in area, doesn't add that much in wattage. It doesn't add an order of magnitude, maybe 3 times more watts, and these are big hot chips, so let's be very clear. Okay, so I think the main part, and this will be the center stage, is the IPC per cycle. And what it means that not only the frequency increased, but the operations increased. So if you would go to the area of what was done to speed it up so much, the main revolutions I would show, they were made before year 2000. And right now, so if you'll do these synthetics benchmarks, computational benchmarks, you, if you take a processor from 1980s, you'll wait kind of 12 cycles to 13 cycles to do just one mathematical operation on average. And by year 2000, the lowest new CPU would do at least around 1.9 operations per cycle if they were using the same designs, the same new designs. And an Athlon will have 3 operations per cycle, and Pentium 3 will have 3.3, again according to this benchmark. So the speed up factor will be in the ballpark of 40, and from 2022 compared with 2000, the speed up will be just around a factor of 4x. And let's see. So as the ballpark big changes were around 40 times, the biggest chunk of them, it is done in I was split between 1980s and 1990s, and this was splitting the processor to do more per cycle by splitting one architecture, which is named fetch, decode, execute, into separate stages. So this was happening right after the processor was invented, and this would increase by at least a factor of 1.5 to 2, and adding level 1 and level 2 caches, especially as the memory it slowed down, and this benchmark is not sensitive to memory, and widening the between the units inside the processor from 816-bit to even to 64-bit in some processors. All this speed up just in raw numbers. So the processors would execute even with a simple architecture more things per cycle by a factor of 2 or 3, and will wait less for memory, and there is a multiple levels of caching. So this was a factor of 5x, and a factor of 8x. So here you can see the processor side by side, and you can see that the processors would have 8 kilobytes of cache, or 16 on the same architecture of 4086 on the right, and this is in CPU cache, versus a 286 when a lot of processing, instead of being done in 4 by 32 bytes, it will be in 6 bytes prefetch code. So everything, it was much more narrower, and it is important to see also what was done from 1990s to 2000s. So the memory, it was noticed to be slowed down, so the level 2 eventually moved inside the processor, which reduced a lot the latencies and the slowdown. It was using the same architecture of today, which is named DDR themes, and this is crucial because even today we have for high performance coding, we have to take into account how you write your code to be friendly for the memory, memory integrated controller. All the processors have integrated out of order execution with register renaming and so on, and it has also even wider buses, both internally. It has implicit instruction per core. This is mostly a result of out of order execution and the register renaming and other more things, a branch predictor, a simple one initially. So all these ones would improve drastically the performance. They had a bit more cache also inside the CPU sometimes, but also there is this support for SIMD, so they could process many integers per cycle. So single instruction, multiple data, this is the number. And if you do this on top of the whatever 486 had, and 486, depending on the architecture and the iteration, speed up between 4x to even 8x. The other on top, it will be at least 5 times more speed up in the Pentium 3 era CPUs. And okay, so here it's clear why we have 40 times more efficiency per cycle, but why it slowed down. So the most important part is that if you'll compare, and I will go back and forth on the slides, this and this, they look very similar. It's not the same. So for example, you have 2 load stores, and here you have just 1 load address unit in the middle and 1 store address unit. And there are basically more operations done. So basically it goes from 3 operations per cycle to 5 operations per cycle. If you see on the top, we have a basic branch predictor, and here we have a bit better branch prediction. We have double the cache. No, sorry, you have the same cache, but it is a bit wider. There is a better decoder of instructions, and we have wider buses. So before, most operations were 32-bit, right now it's 64-bit registers. And there are also more registers by 64-bit architecture. So the main change is that internally many things they just widen, they are more, but everything is 64-bit. But the processor is a Pentium 3 with very few touches. And this is a very successful processor named Sandy Bridge, or generation 2000 of Core. And what is even more surprising when you compare it to today. So today again we will see more executions units. So here in this scheme you can see kind of up to 9 executions unit, and before it was 7 executions unit. And of course this is sorry, here 10 executions units, my mistake, but here there are 7. So this is the biggest change you could see from 2010 to 2020 as processor internal architecture is done. But you can see also that even compared with this is a cut from the Intel slides from 2018, compared with an architecture which was used before, you can see an increase of 50% of level 1, a bit bigger caches, but everything in architecture is still 64-bit. There is technically access, and it's implemented in some cores and not in others, of from 256-bit SIMD, which was 128-bit in 2000 to 512. And there are some specific accelerators like encryption accelerators or AI accelerators, matrix multiplications accelerators. But it's a bit wider Pentium 3. To all, as a conclusion, you can't see at the end that the architecture basically is stagnated in the sense of architecture. There is no new accelerator architecture which changed internally. This is partially true. There are still many innovations done in individual instructions, but that's the point. So basically the Pentium 3 and kind of architecture, or Pentium 2, from which is derived from architecture, which was the main success to increase the 40 times per cycle, and the fact that you can't increase anymore the gigahertz made the CPUs to stagnate. But some people would notice, if you'll go really into specifics, that even though I show like kind of 2 times widening of the execution units, in fact the execution units, if you take all the components like register renaming and so on, in fact it's more than 2 times the speed up, but the benefits, they go to slow down. So this would answer, when you go to a deeper architecture, meet that you'll not get, even if a future processor will increase by 100 times the execution unit, I would be surprised if the speed up will be more than 3-4 times, because the slowdowns are in other places like in memory. Also, is SIMD wide enough, or why doesn't it speed up itself the application so much? And surprisingly, in fact, it speed up sometimes more than the factor of scaling. So the SIMD they did, and I had it in a previous slide, FMA, fuse, multiply and add, which save not only instructions, but they save round trips to memory, which is this is the killer in performance if you didn't pay attention. And there are programs which they speed up hugely if SIMD works. But on the other hand, SIMD requires that the data to be specially aligned, so it takes some computing power to prepare the data. So the slowdowns are mixed. I mean, there will always be a speed up in using wider SIMD, but it doesn't translate always in faster code. And are we in a computing apocalypse? So very clearly no. Like very likely processor would slow down like doing integer dry stone benchmarks, which are used only to see how fast it's computationally uh, important your processor. You'll see processor to be wider, like M1 and M2 max, but the benefits are very likely shown in a benchmark where it is really optimized for that processor, like what Apple does, which is a bit dishonest benchmarking, which many companies do it no matter what. But we see the rise of accelerators. So kind of everything that is matrix multiplications is not done today too much by our SIMD unit in the processor, but maybe it's done on the GPU, especially huge models of AI. So, in the short term, I would say no, the computing will increase, but it will increase with the mixing and adapting the chips for what we need. And this is not a bad thing. It is, in fact, amazing in my view, because by year 2000 we had very weak GPUs, for example, and today we have photorealistic graphics. And even though it is also here a slowdown, so in 2011 you could play Crysis 2, which looked so amazing and so realistic, and the improvements, they look a bit less bumpy, most advanced. The you have to grant that in every field we are amazingly much better now. So we don't play in an under 1 megapixel of frame buffers in games, but we play 32 megabytes 4K with a deeper bit rate, even with HDR. Okay, so if you want more on this kind of commentaries, it will be great to notice it with a like or a dislike if that's your thing. You can subscribe, and I'll make a series on computing, which I will not mix it with other subjects which I'm doing on my channel. So enjoy and thank you. See you next time.